In 1945, after the war had been won in Europe but before Japan had surrendered, British troops marched into Syria with orders to fire onto any French troops that resisted their takeover. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was nervous, and French President Charles de Gaulle was apoplectic. But how was it that these two nations that had just been such staunch allies during the brutal 6-year war that hadn't even ended were brought so close to conflict between themselves? Well, deciding how far back to go to answer that question is no simple task. But before we go back, I do just want to mention that I'm going to talk about the future of this channel and how videos might be a little different from now on at the end of this video, so do stick around to check that out if you're interested. Before I begin, I just want to signpost a few things. I will be talking a lot about France, but for some of this time period, that doesn't just mean one thing. When Germany invaded France at the beginning of the Second World War, they didn't annex the entire country. A portion of France, and indeed its empire, was left under the control of a government that was eventually referred to as Vichy France, and it was essentially a puppet state of Nazi Germany. A French general called Charles de Gaulle fled to London when France was invaded and was christened the leader of Free France. As he gained support, Free France gained territories and soldiers fighting for France on the side of the Allies against the Axis powers. If I refer to just France, I will be talking about Free France rather than Vichy France. There are a couple of characters I'd quite like to introduce as well. I've already mentioned Charles de Gaulle, who took up residence in London when France fell. One of his first supporters, and the man who he put in charge of the French forces looking to win back the Levant, was Georges Catroux. Another person who is important for the beginning of this story is General Edward Louis Spears, who acted as a British envoy to Syria and Lebanon for much of this time. Spears had taken de Gaulle on his plane when he fled France himself, and had been a great supporter of the French general as he was setting up his influence. They had since fallen out and would grow to become bitter enemies. Two friends that hadn't fallen out, however, were Spears and Winston Churchill. They had met during World War I and had been allies in their opposition to appeasement of Hitler's Germany before World War II. It's worth noting that the main difference between these three and Churchill is that, at the beginning in particular, Syria and Lebanon were not often at the forefront of Churchill's mind in his everyday life. It was one of the only places de Gaulle could place direct French influence, and the other two had duties specifically tied to the region. Churchill, however, was focused on the wider war effort. In these early stages of the war, Syria and Lebanon were seen as viable targets for invasion by the Allies. They were currently under occupation by Vichy France, and were strategically important for a number of reasons, their proximity to oil fields and the Suez Canal, to name a couple. In order to avoid heavy Syrian resistance, Catroux proposed a declaration of independence for Syria and Lebanon, to be given after the invasion. Spears, although initially thrilled, realised upon reading that the French declaration didn't really give much real independence. He had also heard from a defective Vichy French commander that the local populace was more likely to be receptive to British forces than French. Eventually, after much back and forth between London and Catroux, a modified declaration was made and publicly backed by Britain, ensuring that Britain would now be bound to keep France to their word. Britain also saw an opportunity to promote unity between independent Arab countries, which they hoped would bring long-term stability to the region. Churchill hastily assured de Gaulle that he was not looking to take advantage of France's weak position, but de Gaulle was convinced that the British would happily enact their long-term plans at French expense. The invasion began with Catroux making his declaration public, hoping for local support and giving a legitimate reason for invading, to bring about Syrian and Lebanese independence. The Vichy forces were more resistant to British and Free French forces than they had hoped, and the invasion was difficult. It was noted that they were particularly unyielding when fighting their Free French countrymen. Eventually, Vichy France surrendered, but it had been a difficult fight that strained relations further between Britain and Free France. Many in Britain believed that they would have had an easier time without the Free French getting involved, and de Gaulle blamed a lack of British resources allocated to the invasion. In order to lose as little French influence in the region as possible, de Gaulle tried to put Catroux in charge, and then keep negotiations between Free France and Vichy France. Unfortunately, it turned out that Vichy France was only willing to negotiate with Britain, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, didn't make de Gaulle particularly happy and soured relations even further. Now that the invasion had taken place, the question of the independence of Syria and Lebanon was quick to the local populace, who wanted France and Britain to adhere to the promises they had made. Free France had, for the most part, taken over control of Syria and Lebanon. Among many other things, they had taken control of the militia known as the Troupes Spéciales, which was a native fighting force. Cottereau did declare Syria and Lebanon independent, but not in practice, as it became clear to the British that Cottereau wouldn't curb de Gaulle's reluctance to grant Syria and Lebanon true independence. Spears was given further instructions and responsibility over the area. His mission was now primarily to secure the independence of these states, while also trying to preserve the reputation of France. This was to prove quite difficult, but it became increasingly clear to the Foreign Office back in London that Spears didn't care an awful lot for the second part of this mission, and would quite happily solve issues in the region at French expense. Relations soured even further between France and Britain as free elections still continued not to be held in the region. The politicians who supported France and were more likely to give them a favourable treaty were very unpopular and wouldn't win the election if France allowed it to be held immediately. Eventually, with the fall of Tobruk and Rommel's Nazis heading ever further towards the Suez Canal, de Gaulle saw this as an opportunity for an excuse not to hold elections, citing the threat of German invasion. When he announced this publicly, Britain was not happy, and because of this, rejected his request to take military command of the area. Spears used the opportunity to prove to London that he was not exaggerating de Gaulle's ambitions in the area, and talked about how badly the local populace took the news. London cut off de Gaulle's telegraphic communications and used this to force him to allow elections. France still had the problem that the elections wouldn't turn out well for them, and there were plentiful rumours that they would try to interfere with the elections in some way to get what they wanted. Cottereau met with Hashim Bey al-Atassi, promising him that France would not interfere with the Syrian election in return for the favourable alliance that France wanted when al-Atassi formed his government. Given the popularity of al-Atassi's party, Cottereau knew he needed him on side. A mistake had been made, however, because while al-Atassi's party won the election, al-Atassi himself was no longer in charge when they did, and Shukri al-Kuwatli was elected president. He had made no such promises to Cottereau, who by now had left his position and been replaced by a man named Jean Helieu. In Lebanon, elections were held a little later. Spears had worked hard to make sure the French preference for president stood no chance, and eventually Bashara al-Khoury was elected, despite various French efforts to influence the election so he wouldn't be. The real disaster for the French, as it turned out, was the prime minister that al-Khoury selected. Spears, hoping to see a prime minister that would fight for and so ensure Lebanese independence, supported Riyad az-Sul as prime minister, and managed to get the other potential candidates to publicly support him as well. Az-Sul was keen for British support, and keener still to remove the influence of France from his country. None of what he did when he was made prime minister went down particularly well with the French. He removed French as an official language, which was considered a great slight, and then stood up to Helieu when Helieu refused to accept az-Sul's new manifesto and questioned the possibility of Lebanon remaining independent. Az-Sul pointed to Cottereau's declaration of independence and said that France could not renege on that promise. Helieu tried to delay the Lebanese government's vote on the new manifesto, but he was ignored. Spears, at this point, started hearing of some of what Helieu had been doing and privately asked what was going on after a dinner they both attended. Helieu basically promised that all was well, and that he wasn't going to do anything that would cause any disturbances. One of the mistakes that France seemed to have made during their dealings with Syria and Lebanon was that they assumed that they had far more popular support, as it turned out they did. French officials believed that the people of Lebanon hated their government's preference for the British as much as they did, and so assumed any drastic action they would take against the government would be supported by the people. Drastic action is certainly what they took, as in November 1943 they kidnapped President Al-Khoury, Prime Minister Az-Sul, and 2 of his cabinet ministers. Immediately there were protests, some deadly, around the country. Britain wasn't entirely sure what to do when this happened. Spears and his boss Richard Casey wanted to force France to immediately release and reinstate the captured politicians, but London was, again, nervous about making the French look too bad. Spears and Casey tried to make sure that what happened was reported on in the press back in Britain, and eventually Churchill waded in and told his war cabinet to make sure France reinstated the captives. They drafted a demand for Casey to deliver, but Casey, who wasn't quite as concerned as those in London with trying to preserve the dignity and reputation of France, wanted it to be more hardline and demand that the prisoners be reinstated in their elected government positions. Interestingly, Coutreau met with Casey on his way back to Damascus to try to resolve the issue, and privately begged him to keep British demands light, so France didn't come out of this looking particularly bad or weak. Casey didn't have any sympathy for Coutreau, who continued on to Damascus. Eventually, more united British political pressure did force the French to release their prisoners and reinstate Al-Khoury as president. Al-Khoury then refused to appoint a new government and, against orders from his superiors, Coutreau allowed him to reinstate the old one. Hellieu was withdrawn from his post and replaced by a man named Paul Beynet. Despite Coutreau's hopes, the new Lebanese government wasn't particularly keen to negotiate any treaty with France after the incident. There were a couple of years of relative peace in the region after what happened during the elections. At least, relative peace between Britain and France. And I mean relative because there was still a straining of tensions, and quite seriously at certain points. Multiple Zionist terrorist groups started targeting British assets and officials, and British intelligence eventually found out that these groups were being funded and supported by France, partially to undermine British authority in the region. How extensive this was isn't entirely clear, but it came to a head when Casey's successor, Lord Moyne, was killed by one of these terrorist groups. Part of the reason why Lord Moyne was targeted was because he was trying to establish an area of larger Arab unity in an attempt to bring stability to the region, often referred to as the Greater Syria idea. It was also hoped that with this political stability, it would be easier to try to bargain to set up a permanent national Jewish homeland, as the British government had publicly supported since 1917. It's not entirely clear to what degree the British supported Zionism, and I imagine there's a lot of historiographical debate around it. It would of course vary with changing governments, and Churchill's support is debated. While he spoke many times in support of a Jewish homeland, some historians say his support was sporadic and uncommitted, whereas others have said it was more long-term and sincere. In any case, it was clearly not his greatest priority when it came to foreign policy. The Arab Federation plan itself was very much driven by Moyne, but Spears was a big proponent of it as well, and worked hard with Arabs in Syria to try to bring it to fruition. One aspect of the plan that I'm sure didn't really bother Spears was the fact that, in order for the plan to work, France would have to be removed from the region. Not only did Spears find that the plan was fairly popular with Arabs he spoke to, but they were keen for British support in the matter as well. French intelligence was made aware of these meetings and indeed much that had been discussed, and saw it as yet another ploy by Britain to remove French influence in the region. With this and rising political pressure from the Foreign Office in London, Spears was eventually removed from his position and replaced by Terence Schoen. Due to his unpopularity in the Foreign Office, much of what Spears reported back was treated as over-exaggeration due to his newfound Francophobia. But, as with the events of 1943, Spears' reports of growing tension in the region towards France were not unfounded. Tensions especially arose over the commandment over the local militia and levy forces. The local gendarmerie force were badly equipped to deal with maintaining domestic security, and Spears had negotiated a deal where Britain would supply them with arms to help them in this plight. This was somewhat controversial in London, as he had done so without the Foreign Office's express approval, and it was, naturally, incredibly controversial with the French authorities, who, once again, saw it as a British effort to undermine their own security by arming local forces. Another particular point of contention was the command over the Troupes Spéciales, a native 20,000 strong force which, if you might remember, the French maintained control over after the invasion. A very reluctant Spears had unsuccessfully tried to convince Syrian officials to allow France to maintain their control of the forces, at the instruction of the Foreign Office. In April of 1945, the Syrian government had clearly had enough, and made an official request for the Troupes Spéciales to be transferred to their command. France refused. There are a variety of reasons for de Gaulle's confidence, most of which centred around the belief that Britain wouldn't intervene, both because they weren't able to, and because they cared more about keeping positive Anglo-French relations than Syria's independence. He was also fueled by a fruitless desperation for France to be seen with the same international prestige as the UK, US and USSR after the war had ended. At this point, France had been reconquered and Germany was in tatters. In order to support their position and maintain control over the Troupes Spéciales, France sent a cruiser full of reinforcements to Beirut in order to quash any unrest in Syria. As further reinforcements departed for Beirut, Britain once again protested to de Gaulle, who launched himself furiously, although not physically, at the British ambassador, but also claimed that the troops were there to facilitate the handing over of the Troupes Spéciales. De Gaulle now used this military pressure to force the Syrian government into a favourable treaty with France, including commercial rights and French military bases in Syria. It's not entirely clear whether or not de Gaulle planned to hand over the Troupes Spéciales if his requirements were met, or if permanent control over the force was a part of the deal he wanted, as the sources I've been using seem to disagree on this. At any rate, it seems the French troops did not have the desired effect, and the Syrian and Lebanese governments stopped negotiations and refused to enter into them again while reinforcements were still present in their lands. They were also having the opposite effect that they had hoped when it came to calming local disorder as well. Upon arriving, French troops had held pro-de Gaulle celebrations, no doubt influencing Arab nationalists to hold demonstrations of their own. There are some claims, to varying degrees, that the Arab protests showed support for Nazi Germany. As the protests grew in size, France used this to internationally justify their military forces in the region, saying they needed to maintain public order. After the deaths of 3 French soldiers during a riot on the 20th of May, the British Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East, General Bernard Paget, went to meet Benet to offer support from the superior British forces nearby. Benet, if you remember, replaced Hallew when he was removed. Benet refused Paget's offer and confirmed Paget's beliefs that the French troops were only there to put pressure on the local governments. Pockets of rebellion had started appearing around the region, and when some of these rebels attacked French troops and captured military equipment, France responded by mortaring and bombing a nearby town. Schoen, who, if you remember, replaced Spears when he was removed, tried to diffuse tensions between the two sides, but Benet seemed to believe the time was right to sort out the Syrian disorder with violence if necessary. On the 19th of May, the French general Oliver Roger started a bombardment of Damascus. Unstable is one of the kinder epithets I've come across that has been used to describe Oliver Roger. A French bomber launched an attack on the old medieval citadel and French troops reportedly drove around the city, unleashing machine gun fire at will. Whether Oliver Roger attacked on his own or not, Benet did nothing to try to stop the Damascus rampage as it continued. Internationally, the first United Nations conference was being held at the time, and given that it was setting itself up with the intention of being more active than the somewhat ineffective League of Nations, the situation in Damascus was a prime example of exactly the kind of thing they wanted to stop happening, much to the embarrassment of the French delegates present. As it continued, pressure on Britain piled on. Paget's forces were the strongest military body in the area, and as the Allied Commander-in-Chief, he had the right to give orders to the French soldiers if need be. It seemed like it was up to Britain to act. Churchill was wary of upsetting the French, who had of course been accusing the British of trying to get rid of them for years, and so marching in and taking military command would be a true point of no return in the relations between the two countries. He was also wary of acting like an imperial power, so he asked for American support. With this support, Britain's intervention would look like an international effort to maintain peace, rather than just two imperial powers fighting over Syria. President al-Quwatli had begged Cohen to intervene, both appealing to Britain's duty to stop rampant militarism and, as the attacks continued, accusing Britain of breaking their promise to Syria if they did not step in. He also promised to pursue both the unity of Arab countries that Britain had been so encouraging of, and a favourable alliance with Britain, with commercial and military benefits. Ironically, this was exactly what France had wanted to be offered themselves, and had been accusing Britain of fostering such an alliance at their expense. Despite not receiving a reply from the US President for support, at midday on the 31st of May, Churchill told de Gaulle that he was going to deploy Paget's forces to the area and that French troops should stop fighting and withdraw, or risk coming into conflict with British troops. De Gaulle's reaction was to resist, and he initially wanted to have the French forces try to resist the British. After pleading from his foreign minister and an eventual understanding of how outnumbered and outmatched the French were in the region, he agreed that he shouldn't risk war with Britain. Oliver Roger initially refused to recognise Paget's authority over him when he was found in Damascus that evening, but when orders came through from Beirut the following morning, the attacks stopped and the French troops left the city. In the afternoon, British tanks and troops marched into the city to public celebration from the people of Damascus. French citizens around Syria were put under curfew, and the soldiers couldn't use their planes or ships or offensively use any firearms. These harsh orders were fairly controversial, even with some in Britain, but it was seen as the best way to not only protect the Syrians, but the French soldiers as well, who were now at risk of revenge from Syrian nationals. During the raid on Damascus, hundreds had died, and the city had been severely damaged, with many of the historic and culturally important buildings suffering the worst. Whatever de Gaulle had hoped to achieve by putting pressure on Syria by bringing French troops to the country, he did not. French influence in the region, instead of becoming insurmountable as hoped, completely evaporated. In the coming days, de Gaulle and other French spokesmen would claim numerous false accounts of events, usually finding a way to blame the British for what eventually happened and never, as far as I have found, expressing regret for the civilian casualties inflicted by Oliver Roger's attacks. De Gaulle was apparently eventually found completely convinced that the crisis had been entirely manufactured by the British to drive France out of the country. The diplomatic aftermath overall was, as can be expected, quite awkward at best. The Foreign Office desperately tried to repair relations, but they seemed to be the only ones who were particularly interested. De Gaulle told the British ambassador to Paris that Britain had betrayed the West and suggested the only reason French soldiers weren't told to open fire on the British was because they didn't really stand a chance. The longer-term impacts to the two countries were considerable, although, as with many long-term effects of anything, it's difficult to say just how many other factors influenced events other than the crisis in the Levant in 1945. De Gaulle's relationship with Britain was, as far as I can find, never really described as positive afterwards. When the European Economic Commission was formed, which was the precursor for today's European Union, de Gaulle used France's veto to block the UK's entry twice, delaying the UK's introduction into the EEC for a decade. After losing their influence in Syria, France became even more determined to maintain its pre-war empire, with little success. They didn't entirely give up on the ability to influence the politics of the Middle East, and pursued a pro-Zionist foreign policy, which, it was hoped, would decrease British influence in the region. Interestingly, I read one historian who, writing in 1959, argued that British influence was essentially destroyed as a result of France being pushed out after the crisis in 1945. He argued that the preference that Middle Eastern nations tended to have for the British was there because it provided support against other European powers in the region, and Britain was not seen as much of a negative in that regard. After the war, however, with Germany and Italy defeated and France pushed out, British influence slowly disappeared because there was less need for British protection. He also argues that there are more complex reasons for Britain's Middle Eastern influence fading as well, but it's an interesting idea. At any rate, Britain did see favourable relations with Syria and Lebanon for a time. They may not have engineered the crisis, but the removal of French influence and the Syrian gratitude that came with it would have been very welcomed by British officials, especially those who had resented what they believed to be French over-involvement in the first place, like Spears. The fallout it brought with France would have been less welcome. Despite soured relations, Churchill was still keen to have France returned as a major European power, and continued to try to help increase French influence in a more measured way than perhaps de Gaulle would have liked. Internationally, France was universally condemned, which only fueled de Gaulle's rage. Both Syria and Lebanon were considered independent countries and founding members of the United Nations, although Syria gained full independence the following year in 1946. It perhaps would be remembered more by history if it weren't for the 1956 Suez Crisis, where Britain and France worked together and fought alongside Israel against Egypt. The result was generally considered an international disaster for both countries. I've come across a few interesting moments while researching this that have made me think, what if? But the impact of France going to war with Britain over this seems limited. France simply wasn't in a position to fight, so in the incredibly unlikely event that they decided to, I suspect blame would have eventually been pinned on individuals like Oliver Roget and perhaps even de Gaulle. It may have even turned into a crisis for the United Nations, who would have sought to put down such needless conflict so soon after the war in Europe had been won. Well, this video was only supposed to be about 10 or so minutes long, and I can see by the word count of the script that it's going to be over 20. Maybe even more. I will say this about what happened in the Levant for those few years. Do be careful about judging these characters just on their actions here. There's a lot to be judged, to be sure, but it's generally a bad idea to take someone's character from a single incident. Although, I won't blame you for not thinking particularly highly of Oliver Roget. But it's not our job to judge history, simply observe it, and try to work out how and why it all happened. This script was written quite differently from the scripts of the past, at least of the videos that aren't the bigger documentaries. This is the first history video I've made after graduating with an English and history degree, and it has naturally influenced the way I've researched for this video. In doing so, I realised that it has just become too long, and I want to make videos more regularly than the amount of effort it took to make this video allows. This topic was particularly difficult to research though, because I haven't found too many texts that actually go into detail about how it all happened. One book I found only spent a paragraph on the crisis and didn't mention the bombing of Damascus, only that British troops had marched in, taken over Syria, and that it had caused a strain in Anglo-French relations. Hopefully I'll be able to find a middle ground for how I research for videos. I also, naturally, often get carried away by reading up on events and topics that, while related, were not really relevant. What I've done for this video, and what I might do for others, is create a public version of the script, and footnoted many of the points I've made, referencing the texts and pages I found the information. You can find the link to that document in the description below. If you have any questions relating to that, feel free to leave a comment on this video and I will try to answer as best I can. I'm hoping to continue with a more regular upload schedule, but we'll have to see what we can do. For anyone interested in The Traveller, the short film that I'm making that Ben has helped to produce, it has of course been delayed, but should be out in 2024. If you enjoyed this video and feel like we deserve it, please do leave a like and subscribe if you want to hear more from us.